This is sort of the most challenging moment of the day, just after lunch. So I hope that we can provide you with some interesting presentations and have a debate afterwards. I was very happy to hear this morning that the president of IDRC, Jean Level, spoke of civil registration and vital statistics as important for good governance, and that it's a global priority and it's a development priority. However, the most important to me was the good governance aspect of civil registration. So registering, enrolling people in civil registries is important, but not enough for this to be development or contribute to development. Having a proof of identity, having a proof of one's identity through an identity credential, whether this is a birth certificate, a national identity card, or another token, is what it takes for people to actually access benefits, services, and their basic rights. A civil register depends on a legal and institutional framework, and this is an integral part of the governance and the machinery of a government. And the existence of a government is not sufficient for a state to be able to provide basic services to its citizens. Governance is how these services are provided and is necessary. And there have over the years been extensive debates about what constitutes good governance. It is broadly defined as the functioning, the capacity, the rules and institutions of the public sector, and reflects not only the complexity of the concept, but also the evolution of the political processes that go along with it, the politics, including decision-making processes in many countries of the world. Thus, governance should be understood as a concept in progress that is also part of a political progress, and this is where civil registration and vital statistics come in as really important tools. By having three really interesting country cases, countries that have actually been focusing on building up registration systems to be able to provide access, or as tools to be able to provide access to services, benefits, and basic rights, but at the same time provide the vital statistics that is necessary for a government to make informed decision. I think we have a lot to learn. Not much has been, none of these countries have really been banging their drums telling how important their work has been, what they've been doing, but both Chile, Namibia and Romania have been able to achieve really important progress over the years. They will also be looking for the economic case for linking civil registration and vital statistics with social development. As many of you know, I've worked for 25 years in Latin America, so I am very partial to that region. And many of you will know the conditional cash transfer programs of Brazil, Bolsa Familia, and Mexico, Oportunidades. Chile Solidario may not be as famous, but it has been a model for a lot of the other conditional cash transfer programs in Latin America. And all these three countries that I mentioned, the conditional cash transfers have actually contributed to reducing inequality in their respective countries. And the two reasons for this has been the targeting mechanisms based on good statistics and the identification of the beneficiaries. So with us this afternoon we have Ivan Arcos, who is a policy advisor to the Minister of the General Secretary of the Presidency in Chile. He was formerly, prior to that, he worked at the Inter-American Development Bank. And prior to that, he was the director for this Chilean civil registration systems, which is unique globally, I would think, in that it not only incorporates civil registration and civil identification, but 30 other registries, and everything is tied together through their unique identity number. Also, from a very interesting country case is Anette Forsingdal, who is the director of the National Population Register, Identification and Production under the Department of Civil Registration in the Ministry of Home Affairs and Immigration. She has been responsible for really putting Namibia on the map as a very progressive country when it comes to civil registration and civil identification. And prior to that position, she worked as a consultant to UNICEF in the region. Andrei Gheorghe is the legal counselor in the Ministry of Justice in Romania in the area of legal advice on all governmental bills and decisions regarding the constitutionality and legality of governmental bills and decision with general competence in the field of constitutional framework, legislative technique, civil registration, social assistance, central and local administration, public-private partnerships, public procurement framework, contracts, companies, energies, competition, and mineral resources. So, which is quite, yeah. I'm glad you could join us here. Fourth on this panel is Arjan Haan, who is the program leader on employment and growth here at IDRC. And before that, he was a senior lecturer at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague in the Netherlands. And prior to that, development advisor to DFID. He's been in London, Delhi, and Beijing. And, just to show how small the world was, last time we saw each other was 10 years ago in Ethiopia. So without further ado, I would like the panelists to spend about 12 to 15 minutes on their presentations, because I would very much like to have a discussion with you all afterwards, and obviously with the participants here. So Ivan, with this, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me here today. I will talk about the importance of a comprehensive identity management system and how the Chilean government is using it to design social policy. First, I will explain what is a comprehensive identity management system. Then I will show you, I will describe very briefly the institutional framework in my country, the Civil Registry institutional framework. I will show you two examples of how this system has been used during the recent years, and I will conclude with some final remarks based on my professional experience as a former director of the Civil Registry, the work that me and I did during my years at the IDB, and the work that I do now with the minister, that one of his responsibilities is to oversight the accomplishment of the presidential commitments. And these two examples are part of them. First, I will use MIA's definition of a comprehensive identity management system, and it is basically the perfect integration of civil registry, civil identification and the issuance of identity tokens. For what? To be used as a tool for the government to design and implement social policies to improve access to social benefits, to improve to guarantee civic rights. So, what happened in Chile? In 1884, it was created the figure of the Civil Registry Office. It's a public officer. It's a person with a jurisdiction that was in charge to register the vital events. It replaced the churches that were doing that at the time. The priests were actually registering people. In 1925, the government created the General Registry of Conviction. It was administered by the police, but the importance was that introduced in our country the ID using the fingerprints. It's the first time that we use biometrics as a way to identify people, even though it was just, at the time, just criminals. In 1930, the service of the public agency is created. I mean, as a centralized agency with office throughout the country. In 1943, incorporates the function of identify people. So now it's not just for criminals, it's for everyone. And began the issuance of identity cards. In 1952, this name change to recognize both functions, the civil registry and the identification function. So now it's called today the Civil Registry Identification Services. In 1982, this is an important part. We introduced for the first time the national ID number. So from then, each person has an ID number that identifies, and it's widely used. I will show that later. In 1919, the government incorporates technology for the first time. So now the office, the civic official, is able to print out a certificate. Before that was done manually. So now they can print it out. In 2001, they are delivered online. And now we are, the Civil Registry Identification Services interoperates mostly with all the administration, and is beginning to offer biometric service to the private sector. It's to identify people using the ID. There is a very brief description of the institutional framework. And when I say institutional framework, I'm talking about legal framework, I'm talking about administrative framework, I'm talking about cultural framework also. So we have this framework, and I will, let me show you two examples of how this system is currently used. And these two policies that I will show you seek to answer two questions. How to improve access to public services, and how to improve the delivery of social benefits. So the first one is the unique password, and the second one is the social registry of household that is administered by the Ministry of Social Planning. The unique passport, or clave única in Spanish, is the way that allows a citizen to electronically interact with the government. So the civil registry deliver an activation code to each citizen. The activation code is related with the ID number that each citizen has, and so we are able to create a password to request online through online services, certificates or documents, or interact with the social registry that I will show you in a minute. It's not the. You will know now that it's not easy for a person to safely interact with, electronically interact with the government, because it's difficult to actually know who is requesting doing the request. But it's a step forward, and it's a very, very big step forward for the government, because it's much, much faster to deliver a lot of documents that people lot time personally going to office to request them. The second example that I will show you is the Social Registry of Household. It was created in 2016, and we had a system in Chile to deliver social benefits that required that a person goes to a municipality to present their papers and then request the specific benefits. So each municipality, there are 352 municipalities in Chile, has different procedures to deliver that benefit. So the government basically said, we have a lot of information now. We have administrative databases, and we have the ID number, the national ID number, to match the information across databases. So it changed and created the registry. So now, with the national ID number, match the information across the databases that the government already has, and allows the citizen to interact with the registry, complementing the information, rectifying it, or modifying it. And the citizen can do it both ways. They can personally go to the office, or can use the unique password or clave única to do that online. If they do that online, the data is automatically updated. So now, this new system decreases the risk of fraud because it's not self-reported. It helps to focus much better social policy, as I will show you later, and incorporates people that for various reasons they were having troubles to access. For example, people living in rural areas, that it's difficult for them to actually go to an office to request some specific benefits. Conditional cash transfers in Chile are actually delivered by using this registry. So the people do not have to request the benefits because the government already knows if a person has or not the right to receive it, or the requisite to receive it. So finally, I was very fast too. So for final remarks to conclude this presentation. First, talking about institutional design. I would say institutional design is very country specific. We have just one institution to do both processes, civil registry and civil identification. But there are several countries that have more than one institution to do that. And it is important to get the perfect integration between those systems, to incorporate not technology, but the right administrative procedures to allow the institution to interoperate. So when we talk about institutional design, it's very tempting to create a model. This is the perfect way to model all of this process. And from my experience, I would say it is very important to take into account the specific characteristic of a country. At the end, the most important part is to get the product that you get at the end. It has to be standardized. But you have to allow the process to incorporate a specific condition, cultural condition, for example. About technology. Technology helps. It helps a lot. But if you don't have the right institutional framework put in place, there are several risks that you are not taking into account. For example, the protection of personal information. A software cannot do that. The government can do that. It can enforce that protection. When designing this kind of processes, civil registry, civil identification, the issuance of tokens, identity tokens, you have to take into account to put the right incentives. What do I mean with that? If the government is investing in create an agency or invest in a process to deliver certificates or to deliver an ID document, somebody has to use it. So, you are wasting resources. So at the first stage, I would say the government makes the investment and it's a supplier of documents. But at the same time, the government is the first customer of the document. The government must use the document that is actually producing. That produces the cultural change. So now in Chile, everyone knows that has to register the vital event and has to have an ID document because the government will request it. Finally, I will say that it's very difficult to talk about inclusive development, social inclusion, financial inclusion, if we are not able to guarantee the basic human right as the right to a name. That's the cornerstone of all of this process. The government must be able to guarantee this right, and the knowledge must become, at some point, must become policy. Because, in my opinion, I have the conviction that the right to a name, the protection of the right to a name, guarantee the right to a name is way too important to just be an academic exercise. Thank you. I'm sorry for my English, but it's kind of rusty, but anyway. Hopefully you understand, and if you have any questions, we can ask me later. Thank you. Sorry.
Excellent. Gracias. Thank you very much, Ivan. Those are important lessons, both lived and learned in Chile, that it is about access to services for the government, but also access to government services, but also delivery of benefits. That is one of the key elements of identity management. With this, I will hand over to Anette for the presentation of the Namibia case.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to partake in this very important conversation about strengthening of civil registration system. And thank you, Mia, for also allowing us to be part of the maths about Namibia. Namibia, today, I very much speak about our digitalization. Today, I'm more looking between the link between legal identity and social services. It's not very well explored in Namibia. So I'm just going to go through the data from the National Population Registration System and kind of see if there's any correlation to our child grant registration. And then I'm also looking at some of the other interventions that we have implemented to strengthen our system and some of our newest innovation projects. Okay, so this is Namibia. So we are a country in the southern Africa, just north of South Africa and west of Botswana and south of Angola. So Namibia is like a huge country, but with a very small population, and that itself obviously give us, as a government, some different implementation problems. It's difficult for us to reach out to our rural population. So about 50% of our population is living in urban area. Just to tell you that the capital, we're only like 350,000 people, just tell you that even what we call urban areas, fairly rural areas. So it takes a lot of effort and a lot of resources to reach out to our population. So maybe we're only 2.4 million, but we spread all over on a very large territory. Okay, this is our latest statistics from our national population registration system that has only been functional since about 2012, 2014. This is an integrated system. It basically built on our ID production system and our ID registration system, where we basically added a birth, death, and marriage component. So all data now sits under one citizenship profile. And it's something that we have initiated and developed within government ourselves. So it's a very homemade project, if you can say so, but it's very well functioning. So if you look at the data, you can see this is the birth rate. That is the projected birth rate that you see on the top. And then below you can see on the red, that is children on the blue, that is children that is registered within the required time, 4 weeks by law, and then you have the rest up to 1 year. Before it in Namibia becomes a late registration. So so from since 2013 to 2017, we have seen an increase in early birth registration, and that's what I want to speak about. So here you're just seeing it as a percentage. So in about 13, it was just above 40%. Now we're above 60% with timely birth registration. Unfortunately, I don't have reliable data prior to that. I do have some data that shows from about 2008 we had about 30%, but it's unreliable. This is basically data from the National Population Registration System. Here, it doesn't also show you that most children are actually then registered before they turn 2 years at the moment. We still have late registration up to, like people who's above 20 years old that is still being registered. But predominantly people are registered before they turn 2 years old. This is data from 2016. Here you would see that this is like from our 14 regions, and some regions are doing much better than others. So in the urban centers, you would see, especially in Commerce, where the capital Windhoek is, you can see that we've got very high birth registration rates. It's the same in some of the southern region, but if you go to some of the northern regions, the two Kavangos, as we call them, and Zambezi, the birth registration rates are very, very low. So this is some of the interventions that we have had over the years. So initially what we did was to expand our structure and provide much better access to birth registration. It was part of a UNICEF initiative that supported us to open hospital-based facilities, which we have 23 today. But even though we improved accessibility, you can see in 2013, we started that in 2008, and the main drive was between 8 and 12. It didn't really affect our timely birth registration much. It came up to about 40%. What happened in 2014-15, we had like a major, what we call the turnaround, which was driven by our minister, where all our processes was reviewed, and all our officers was basically got new procedures. At that time, I was very skeptical of if these. It was basically about providing better services, and I never thought that would have a specific kind of influence on the birth rate. because we already have very clear processes. It's very easy to go in and apply for a birth certificate, and you will basically be issued with a birth certificate on the spot. One of the things we did do, though, was that all our staff members now had to go on a daily basis and inform expecting mothers or newly, the mothers who's just given birth, that they had to go and register their birth. In 2014 and 2015, a new initiative came in. And at the same time, we also started our whole digitalization project, where I'm saying that we digitalize all our registers, the birth, marriage, and death register. And we scanned all our historical records, so it became much easier to get access to those records, and everybody now had one profile on our population registration system. So the question is if any of these interventions in fact had any impact on our birth registration rate. The last one is our newest project that I will speak more specifically about, which is called the e-birth notification system. But first, I just want to look at the demand for registration, grant registration. So you can see there that from 2014, there was about 150,000 that was on child grant. What changed in that year? That previous, it was only single or double orphans who could receive a grant, or children with disabilities. What happened there was that now children, vulnerable children, the vulnerable grant was introduced, and that was a means-tested grant. And suddenly, up to now, to the end of 2017, 200,000 more children has actually been registered for a grant. So the question is, if that was not actually what has impacted, had an impact on the birth registration grant, and none of the actually major initiatives from the ministry, which have had other purposes, but I'm just specifically today looking at the birth rate. I believe that could possible has given a push to demands for birth certificate, that more children could now access their grants. Here what I've done, I've been trying to look at the birth registration rate and the ID rate and see how it correlates with people who's got access, or their main source of income is a wage salary. I want you to specifically look at 3 regions, and that is the Kavangos East and Kavango West, where you can see there's a very strong correlation between low birth registration, low ID registration, and the main income source being a salary. And if you then look at the Kunene region is very similar in the sense that there's like mainly a large, very indigenous group of people who live a very nomadic lifestyle from that region, which is basically considered in Namibia as a very marginalized group. But if you look, they have got fairly high birth registration and ID registration, but very low access to, or their main income or from a salary is very low, just like the Kavangos. If you then look at the next slide, you can now see I have put in access to the child grant. And interesting, it has no meaning for the Kavango regions. So that means that we have not somehow, the grant has not created any demands for birth certificate and IDs. Whereas it's different in a Kunene region where the grant registration is very high. So I'm wondering if that somehow not have been a driver for birth and ID registration in that region. But I'm very worried about the Kavangos, because does that mean that we have an intergenerational problem in the Kavango regions where parents don't have access to IDs, and because they are undocumented, they cannot register the birth. So they are now caught in a situation that they cannot actually access our grants. So even though there's a grant, it's not a driver for birth registration because the parents are undocumented. It's just a thought. I have no conclusion on this. It's just something I wanted to present. This is our last innovation project that we call the e-birth notification system. So the purpose of the e-birth notification system is basically to capture all birth notification when they've occurred. As you would see before, we are at the moment relying on the projections. We don't have any data, reliable data on how many births that occurs in Namibia. So this is the process that a mother comes into the maternity ward. She has to identify herself. It's linked up to the national population system through an inquiry. We then populate her admission record. There's no e-health system. This is the only electronic system that exists. So when we have established her identity, then within the next 24 hours, hopefully she gives birth to a live child. That child's detailed, very few detail is now captured and saved. If you do have an email address, an email will then be sent to you. From that moment, you can go and register your birth in any of our offices, being hospital-based or sub-regional or regional office. So what we do is basically the mother come in with her ID. We have already captured her details on the ID. We basically populate directly from the e-birth notification system, establish paternity, establish citizenship, and the name of the child, and then we issue a birth certificate. So there's obviously, so the question is this a potential game changer in Namibia? Yes, in some ways, because like 87% of all births do occur in a birth facility, and through consultations with the health facilities, we have learned that most mothers actually bring their children in within a week after birth. So we will capture most births. That means that we have now identified all the mothers and the fact that they haven't given birth to a child. So if she passes away or abandons the child, we can always establish the child's identity based on the mothers. We know that this birth has in fact occurred within Namibia. It's our obligation to register the child. We know who the mother is, and we can then continue registering the child. I think that is probably one of the biggest benefits of it. Then another thing is obviously we can now list all the unregistered children. We have got the identity of the mothers, and we can target the mothers if they haven't registered the child within a given time. And then we will have a very comprehensive set of civil registration data from birth all the way through to death. All these things can now be extracted. All the data can be extracted directly from our National Statistic Bureau, and we have published our first vital statistics reports. So that gives a lot of benefits. I'm a very personally believe that we should link the systems up to the social protection program. So if there's been consideration to introduce a universal grant, we basically link the birth registration with the social grant. So when you apply for your birth certificate, you at the same time also apply for your social grant. That could be a way maybe of driving the birth registration to much higher. Obviously, the big risk in this is that all this data that we collected is being not used for any program purposes. I already see it that if we don't use it to list the mother and targeted mother, it's just going to be in vain. Okay, this is our death, and I just want to show you the first graph you're seeing. This is from our survey, our census intercentral survey. It shows you we've got 90.5% death registration in Namibia. We've got very, very good incentive for death registration. There's many different reasons to register your death. But the interesting part is that if you look at our actual data in the National Population Registration System, it's about 6,000 registration lower. And the interesting part, after we spoke about gender mainstreaming yesterday, I checked the data, is that if you look at the data from the census, there's an overrepresentation of female death. But if you look at our actually data from the national population system, it's just the opposite way around. So now I'm worried that maybe there's an under-registration of girl children in Namibia. Okay, time. Okay, this is our new e-death notification system that at the moment we have done all our consultations, and this is the agree process. So the idea is that the nurse notify or fill in electronically a form that a death has occurred. Then the doctor comes. He then does electronically the causes of death, the ICD-10. Then, when that is done, a notification number is issued, put on the body, that is moved to the mortuary register that the body in fact exists, and then after that, the family can then come for the registration of the death, and we will take all the additional data element needed for vital statistics. Okay, what is the challenges of this new innovation? It's basically governance and the coordination, because we have so many government institutions involved in this. I just want to mention that this project for the e-birth and e-death is supported by UNICEF and the Canadian government. It's a huge coordination between all these things, and there's problems about governance because the project management is done from Ministry of Home Affairs. But if there's problems in terms of capturing, it's difficult to actually reach the matrons. There's problems with our data quality. The data quality is simply not high enough. We have got problem with timely recording. There's a tendency, specifically at the moment at the hospital, they don't record the event, they postpone it, and then the birth cannot be registered. We've got very, very low usage of this data. Nobody's particularly interested in our data at the moment, even though we have got very rich data. And then we're having a problem basically of breaking this intergeneral cycle of undocumented persons that we need to address soonest. And then obviously the maintenance of the system and equipment it's also, even though it's all government funded, it is a problem because they all sit out in the regions. Thank you very much. Oh, if there's time, may I show? Okay.
Thank you very much, Annette, for keeping on time. Namibia is an interesting case in a process in development, so I think we can expect more interesting results between what is being done to improve birth registration, death registration, and also the usage of data. Romania has had more time to mature their system, so Andrei, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mia, for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I will give you a presentation about two systems working together for protecting the simple civil rights of people, both having a good legal foundation. This is about the civil registration system and also about the social protection system. I will move fast through the general data about Romania. I will only say that the economic indicators, you have there a concept of minimum guaranteed salary, which is a threshold that is established by this governmental decision, under which no legal contract can be concluded by any employer, including the state. This is important to make an idea about the link between this concept and the level of minimum decent living. The civil registration documents and in general the civil registration system in Romania have a few general characteristics. The first one is that any registration is free of charge in principle, and any registration is free. When asking for any civil registration document, a petitioner must complete a vital statistic form, and this is the way that the data from vital statistics are collecting and are delivered directly to the National Institute of Statistics that are making this data available on its official site, also free of charge and also directly in English if you are interested. Another general rule is that the civil registration is compulsory for everyone, even for the foreigners and even for the stateless, and is delivered by the state and the authorities under the same provision of the law and under the same conditions as for the Romanian citizens. In general, the mayor is the civil registrator, but under special circumstances, any person may become a civil registrator in order to keep ongoing the correct and real-time registration. The general rule is that a declaration of birth must be made within 30 days from the birth, and declaration of death must be made in 3 days from the occurrence of death. Another general rule is that no funeral can be authorized, and no religious ceremony of marriage and no baptism ceremony can be performed without the civil registration documents. We have a reasonable perspective that we can do even better in 3 years' time from now, since the Ministry of Internal Affairs has an ongoing project with funds from European Union in order to make a possibility for the petitioners to request for civil registration documents online. You have, the last item is the official site of the National Institute of Statistics. The official site is looking like this. Every 2 months is publishing data on vital statistics from registration, from civil registration system. And it's available in English. About the data of birth, marriage, and death, I will not insist upon them. You have a lot of data that are publicly available. I will only say that the rate of divorce, the rate of maternal death, and the rate of death of children under 1 year is currently decreasing. And now we come to the core of the civil registration system, which is the personal identification number that was established by presidential decree in 1975 under the communist regime and was designed to work properly without any computerization at all, even in the most remote areas with only basic mathematic knowledge. This PIN has a special structure. I will not get into details, but I will make the details available later. This PIN is the link between any public policy or system managed by the state to the benefits of the individuals and a certain person. You have there the legal definition of PIN and his general usage. PIN and all the data from civil registration documents are objects to the provisions of the law regarding the protection of personal data. So this data can be used only with the express agreement of the person that they refers to. The civil status certificate are printed with material elements of safety embodied in even in the paper that they are printed on. This data may be available for other persons on express demand for purpose of public interest actions or for fulfillment of legal obligations by paying legal taxes and by through a contract with the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The tax is fixed to 25 cents per person if the request is for data of only one person or the request refers to a reduced amount of information. For any other cases, the tax is fixed to $30, and this is the way in which in 2017 we have collected that certain amounts to the central budget, and also in 2017. So we may say that the civil registration system is a contributor to the state budget. Now we come to the social protection programs, which I said at the beginning that are also having a legal basis, being stipulated in one or more normative acts. In this respect, all the programs are managed by the central authority, with the exception of the social protection and assistance that is provided by the NGOs. The main incomes of the social protection programs are centralized also. They are social contributions and social contributions of the employers and contributions of the central public administration. You may see the rates from the GDP in this slide. I have made a list with the main social benefits that can be obtained by using civil registration documents from birth till death. As you will see, I will give you details very briefly about a few of them. The state allowance for children is provided by the Article 49 of the Constitution. From birth till 2 years old, the amount is of $50 monthly for each child. And this state allowance continues from 2 years till 18 years old, and the amount is $21 monthly for each child. The state allowance is one of the main incentives for birth registration. The other two benefits that you are looking at in this slide, child rearing benefit and back to work bonus, are two benefits that implies the choice of the parents. That means that if the mother decides to go to work, the father may stay with the child at home and take the child rearing benefit. Or if the mother decides to stay at home, in the last month from the first 2 years of the child, the father may also decide to stay 1 month with the child at home. A special legal benefit is the benefit of free powder milk formula for babies between 0 and 12 months. It's a special law that provides that under medical prescriptions that is delivered monthly, a child may access this benefit entirely free of any charges. These are the cases in which breastfeeding is not possible due to extreme illness. That is the way in 2017. The program had about 31,000 beneficiary babies with a total cost of $1.1 million. Another special benefit is raised as the child grow up and becomes a youth with age between 18 and 35. And this benefit is managed by the local administration. Each local administration has to do an inventory of the land that is in own private property and to publish the results. Any youth may ask the local authority to give in property land in order to build a house, and the surface, the area of the land is going to be some between 150 square meters and 1,000 square meters. This happens because in 2014, 44% of youth were still living with their parents. As we'll see below, the benefit of this program may be cashed together with the benefit of another program, that is the First House program. The First House program we have here will allow to a person that does not own a home to apply for a credit guaranteed by the state with a maximum amount of 50 or 57,000 euros and with an advance of minimum 3,000 euros. The family allowance and the social aid have as foundation the constitutional right of every person to a decent level of living. And I will not insist on that. We'll move to the benefits that can be obtained by using death certificate. I will talk a little more about death allowance. The death allowance, together with the interdiction of performing any funeral without death certificate, are the reasons for obtaining the death certificate, and are the reasons why we have 100% registrations of death. The amount of this allowance for 2018 is quite substantial, even for a person that do not have any contributions to the public social insurance system. And we have now to get to a few elements of conclusions. One conclusions I would say that should be that vital statistics are in Romania generated from civil registration in real time on continuous basis. The civil registration system cannot, the civil registration documents cannot be requested online. However, we have that reasonable period of time of 3 years in which that ongoing program of Ministry of Internal Affairs that I already talked about will allow the petitioner to request these documents online. Another conclusion that I will end with is that, in my opinion, one cannot have a good CRVS system without proper legal foundation. But this foundation must be based on an elaborate field research in the communities regarding their customs, traditions, and practices about these three events of a lifetime, and the law must be drafted according to these customs in order to ensure the willing to comply with that communities. Thank you for the opportunity to share these things together. Thank you for the invitation of this conference. Mulțumesc, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Andrei. A very interesting presentation, and again, delivering social services, linking that to a unique identity number as an attribute, both to access and to deliver service. Last but not least, Arjan Haan will provide us with a more general overview of civil registration for social inclusion.
Thanks a lot, Mia. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for my colleagues. I think I'll be learning more than you will learn from me. I apologize for that in advance. When I listen to the stories, I understand why the work that my colleagues are doing is so important, because this underbuilds everything else that we do for me, right? And that goes all the way up to building of nations. When I listen to the stories about Namibia, it's like, this is, think about these remote districts where that registration, this is about a state that is building a nation, bringing populations into the purview of the nation state. I hadn't promised I would do a general introduction, and just because it's after lunch, I thought I'd tell you a personal story. My case history would actually be about the stories about migrants, and that could be very important stories. I just tell my own, at the risk of then putting you to sleep after lunch, of course. But I suppose people have asked this already. How many people in this room do not have a birth certificate? Were there people in this conference that do not have a birth certificate? Anybody's family members that do not have a birth certificate? So these people, sir, were you stretching, or you also do not have a birth certificate? My partner was born in a small town in India and does not have a birth certificate, and that hasn't caused us any real trouble, but it would for migrants in more vulnerable situations, but caused a lot of nuisance. We moved to the Netherlands, and up till today, it is not the reason why she left, but up till today, her registration in the Netherlands is still recorded as incomplete. My kids were born in Canada. They were born in Canada, you would think so. They were actually born in Ontario. And when we wanted to get a Dutch passport for them, we actually had to. This my first trip to Ottawa was actually because the Ontario, Kirsten will tell you in a couple of days whether I was wrong, but the Ontario issued birth certificate did not have international validity. I had to make the drive to Ottawa to get that recorded by the foreign minister here before I could get a Dutch passport. You can imagine if we have to show our marriage certificate, that's basically hilarious wherever we go. It's a mix of, in each country this looks different. So I understand how important it is. That's the point that I want to make, and this is really about issues of rights, and this is really about nations still state building, how nations integrate the population into that. But I won't bore you more with my personal stories. The three things I want to say in trying to pull some of this together, having learned so much from the presentations, is that we work on social protection, and like health systems, that needs good registration systems, and typically we undervalue that. And I don't need to tell Mia this, because this is what our career has been about. I understand that. The second thing, maybe a little bit, and I think you see that in the presentations, is that there are very important potential synergies if you look at this from a multi-sectoral, a cross-sectoral perspective. And I'm going to extend that to, I think we've seen different examples of social programs, but that also extends to the economic sphere. And that's much more hypothetical, and I think that there's actually a big research agenda on that. And the third thing I want to say is in implementation, as you guys know better than I do, it needs a technical fix, obviously, but it's much more than a technical fix. As I said, for me, I was trained as a historian. I see the building of nation states in what you do. It is about the way that the states reach out to uncovered populations and so on. And I think both Namibia and in the case of Chile, you actually saw that happening. As a historian, I saw that happening in front of my eyes. So just so you know where I work here at IDRC. Despite all the stories about being migrant, I'm really, really local. Our program at IDRC, one of the sister programs of the health group that you know better, we work on issues of employment, economic opportunities of vulnerable groups. Our research try to help find solutions to barriers to women's empowerment and enhance youth employment. And there again are the three most important points that I thought I'd bring to this discussion. So, first of all, lessons from social protection. The global evidence over the last 2 decades have shown that social protection programs in middle and low income context, of course in Romania, but in middle and low income context as well, have been and can be really successful, and in Latin America, for example, have been credited for a large part of the poverty reduction and the decline in inequality that's happened. Most of the lessons are in Latin America, increasingly also in and the youth research agenda in Africa. And each time that you refer to those different contexts, the registration systems that underlie this, as we saw in Namibia, for example, are absolutely critical. Now, I think for the context of this discussion, there are 2 main lessons, and they may sound somewhat contradictory. Simple transfers, cash transfers, work really well. People, particularly women, some men too, make really good use of money. Conditional or unconditional, even unconditional cash transfers have shown to have enormous benefits for individuals, for households, for populations as a whole. But that's the simple lessons, if you like. But and that simplicity is really critical. But the design of those programs is far from critical, far from simple, and it's really critical. And this really applies to the issues of basic different forms of registration. Whether that is the birth registrations, I don't fully understand the difference and what functions, for example, the population registry and then the birth registry has. But some form of registration is really important in the implementation. If those programs are targeted for particular groups, then of course it's really important that you know who is eligible and what the total population is and what the subpopulation is for that eligibility. And that can be very difficult. One of the research project we're currently supporting is on the cash transfer program in Tanzania, and one of the issues there is the question of polygamous marriage. The principle is that the benefits go to women, but how is that organized in polygamous households, for example? These are really very important questions. Thank you. And in a way, if they're universal, so benefits to the entire population, although the targeting mechanism, of course, is very different, but the same principle holds. And that's what I think you see in Chile. It's reaching out to the last X%, where those systems become even more important. So some of the issues of registration and the design of these programs becomes harder as countries get better off. One of my colleagues said, I said, I'm not going to say this. It's like the data is very important, but a lot of good development happens without data. I would hypothesize that China reduced most of its poverty before it started measuring it. And that's not because they didn't know what they were doing. They had good, they had a very strong civil service, for example. They had good knowledge of the situation. They didn't quite have the data. But to reduce from poverty from some 70% to 40% in China was possible with fairly rough means. Now, the further you get down in the poverty reduction, the harder it actually becomes. The examples of how registration policies leverage each other, and I started reading the recent examples of Nepal and Senegal, are really, really important, and I really hope that the team will continue to look at the leverage between the two. I had this quote of the President of Chile before I knew where the speaker of. This for me is the political statement that went ahead of the registration and the social protection system that was in place. And the key there is twofold. One is to reach out to the last 6% that still lived in poverty in Chile around at the beginning of the 2000. And the second thing is that the importance for multiple sectors to know exactly where that 6% was. So again, as I said, it's like the issues of registration are really important in say Senegal, in the remote districts of Namibia. But what you see is that they become even more important to get to the last 6%. Or the design gets harder, rather. It's not more important, of course. So social protection. So the impacts of social protection are multi-sectoral. cash transfers are important, but so are schools, so are hospitals, and there's potentials of synergies between those sectors. Cash transfers work better if there are schools available that allow people to go to these the schools. And for me, the issue of registration go hand in hand with that. There's also an issue of the question of synergy. If you have 20-something different social protection programs that all have their own needs to determine eligibility and implementation, then there've got to be synergies in both in the way the sectors work together and in the way the basic data is provided. So I think that's absolutely a critical issue to look at. Now, the second thing is, and some of the work we've been doing in Latin America with organizations like Proyecto Capital looks at whether there's additional benefit of cash transfers, whether linking the beneficiaries of cash transfers to banks, for example, will allow them to make even better use of the money that is provided, and that's shown a lot of good results, which again underlines the issue of the multi-sectoral importance of this. Once the beneficiaries got bank accounts, and once they got training in various forms of use of those bank accounts, they started investing their money in better ways. So there was additional economic benefits from those transfers as well. The programs, what they call productive-oriented social protection programs in Ethiopia, for example, in Bangladesh as well, show similar issues. Poor people make very good use of cash transfers, but if you provide them with the opportunities to convert that into asset, into small business, they work even better. And again, that brings me to something that again shows that the importance of that multi-sectoral character of the questions, but also the question of informality. And this is an area that I think is completely uncharted. We know that most of the economic activities around the world are in the informal sector. These are not taxed. These are outside the formal. They're outside the formal system. Not necessarily because people are registered, but they remain outside the official economic system. And bringing them into that official system is a very important development question. Not because those people don't want to pay tax, but because they can't enter into the formal system, and therefore they also can't access all sorts of questions. Now that is, I admit, a large jump in the argument, but I think it is a useful thing to think about because and very much because it extends the argument and the rationale for investing in good systems of registration, because it would actually be economic beneficial as well as a social good. All right, so the final thing to say, and I think people have spoken to this already, it requires a technical fix. One, there are multi-sectoral synergies to be built in that, in the implementation as well as the registration, but it's also a political process. It is very much about identity. Diversity matters a great deal. How do you register polygamous households? And in Tanzania is a question. And the implementation of social policies can leverage this, but also have to be sensitive to that diversity. And vice versa, as people have spoken to. At the same time, the registration can be, and there's very interesting questions in the graphs there on Namibia, is that the registration itself can enhance the uptake. And I don't know what cause and consequences, but in a way it doesn't matter, because it does suggest in some places you see the potential of those synergy. And as I said, it can also, in my view, also, but that's a huge research and promote that move from a formal to the informal sector. So, and finally, I think it's very important that access. It is about rights. It is about being a citizen. And thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Arjan. These have all been very interesting presentations. Gone on a little bit longer than we had wanted to. So I suggest we open up for questions and comments, at least one round, while we have the floor here. if you could please come to the microphone and state your name and your organization, please.
Thank you. Ramesh Silva from the United Nations Population Fund. I had two questions for our first two speakers. First of all, thank you for the really, comprehensive overview of the Chilean experience. Super interesting, and almost 150 years of historical institutional memory there. I guess for me, you made this very important point that technology needs a strong institutional framework. And I think we're at a CRVS Innovation Conference, and there's a push now to scale up CRVS systems very, very rapidly. And so I was wondering whether you could unpack for us a little bit if you had to, try to replicate some of the key innovations and advances in Chile in a much, much shorter time period. Where do you see opportunities to do that, and where do you see potential pitfalls or cautionary areas to keep in mind? And then to Annette for Namibia, thanks. Also very interesting. I guess I was wondering a lot. So you mentioned half the population is in rural areas, and you have nomadic subpopulations and all kinds of complex heterogeneity within Namibia. And in terms of understanding, what's, spurring increases in birth registration and death registration, I was wondering, since you're now, in the midst of a digitization process, whether you might be able to factor in the design a sort of behavioral economics kind of approach to actually implement some field trials to test out certain different incentive and disincentive schemes to birth registration and death registration to particularly figure out, using actual, sort of clinical trial style evidence, what is the effect of these different approaches to increasing birth and death registration completeness?
I'll take one more question.
Yes, my name is Omrana Pasha, and I'm from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in Baltimore, in the United States. I have a question for Arjan de Haan. Your talk was very interesting, and I was particularly interested to hear your thoughts about the political impact in countries of increasing birth registration, particularly vis-a-vis the spread of parliamentary seats, and as we see the move from rural to urban in many countries, particularly the countries of South Asia, the increasing political power of urban centers and their current underrepresentation in political systems, and how increasing birth registration would impact that.
If you want to respond.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Let me say that you don't need a 100-year-old institution to incorporate technology. That's the situation of my country. You can do it. I would say you must put in place, institutional safeguard. For example, in the case of personal information, when you incorporate technology, the amount of personal data that you receive is increased, I think, exponentially. So how do you protect that kind of information that is sensitive? You need to put in place administrative procedures, maybe consider some legal changes, maybe not, but at least some administrative procedures to ensure that the information that you receive is going to be protected. And if there is any transgression, there are some way to enforce or to actually punish that transgression. So that kind of consideration you need to take into account when you incorporate technology, because technology itself doesn't resolve that kind of question. I don't know if that answered your your question, but I'm a lawyer, so I'm very partial talking about administrative procedures and legal changes instead of technology. But I mean, the political class, the incentive for the political class is to show something, and it's fancy to show a computer or an ID document, you know, or a website. You cannot show an administrative procedure. It's not fancy. I mean, there is not political incentive to do that. But you must take that into account to incorporate technology, because at the end, if you don't do that, technology will fail. And as a government, you will be responsible for that. Thank you.
In terms of building in an incentive for birth registration, yes, I think that would be very doable, and I do believe that incentives create a demand for birth certificates. Unfortunately, we haven't had the opportunity. It's something that we have discussed with UNICEF, and we haven't had the funding. We've discussed it actually through the Finnish government if we should introduce a baby box to create incentives. I must say, after I did analyze the data and saw the situation in Kavango, I'm not sure that that is always the right solution to all regional birth registration issues, because I actually think that in the Kavango, the problem is not in fact that there's no incentive, because we have some of the poorest populations there. The fact is that they don't have access to documents, and they have been undocumented for generations. So before we resolve the documentation in that region, I don't think an incentive would help. So I think, you know, we just need to go back and analyze our data and see, yes, maybe in some regions, because we do know that the people who register timely now within a few weeks, it's because they need their, if you work, you need your maternal benefits, or you have to pay for your private hospital. That is an incentive itself. But for the poorer population, I do think we also first need to think about some intervention to make sure that both parents and children get documented before we can talk about an incentive.
Arjan?
Thank you. I don't have an answer to the question, but I think what you're hinting at is underlines, I think, the main point I'm making is how deeply political those processes are. I mean, in the United States, we know how political this is. I mean, your previous president was challenged on his birth certificate. Okay, and not forget how an awful story, of course, but how important that could be. I mean, it wasn't, luckily, but how important it could be. And just think about how those accusations would impact on much more vulnerable. It was bad enough as it was that it was raised in the first place, but how much more important that would be on vulnerable people. In the U.S. also, there's a constant manipulation. I don't think it's. I don't know what registration system is underlying that, but there's a constant manipulation of the census borders for political purposes, right? So that clearly demonstrates to you, and whichever side it comes from. I care about which side it comes from, but in a way, what it underlines is that you need an independent system that registers that properly, and that's all within, you know, one nation, and that of course extends hugely to countries where you have large cross-border population. So to the question of what happens in urbanizing cities, like it doesn't actually I don't think it actually changes the conclusion that you need an independent system of not only good birth registration at place, but in that case, just as I was joking about my partner's birth registration, also something that is then transferable to other locations, right? So because for sure there'll be people either people will be denied the right to vote, or at the same time there'll be people that try to double count as well, which in the Indian context, I wouldn't be surprised that it actually happens, but I don't have any evidence for that. So it's the independence of that of good registration is important for proper political representation.
So it seems that we are out of time, but I will still ask the panelists if they would like to wrap up with the final comment. Maybe starting with you, Ivan.
Thank you, Mia. So let me add something that I forgot when I did my presentation. And it's related with technology. And we have, as you saw, we incorporated technology many years ago, and we're using it a lot now. And I'm very supportive for that. But you must not forget, I'm a crazy here, that means the safeguard. The safeguard are not software or hardware. It's institutional framework, it's cultural framework, it's administrative framework. With that, you incorporate technology and you will solve many problems, and you will deliver very fast services and improve access. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, for me, I'm a strong advocate for the actually notification process gets much more attention, because I do believe that is the initial recording of the child and the mother. So even that if there is a delay in birth registration, at least the state knows that a birth has occurred by a specific woman. I think that is very important, because until now we have never known that any birth has occurred before the parents are actually standing in front of us. So I think that is definitely something that needs to be thought into many civil registration systems. It's not just a question about getting the children registered. They must be notified by another legal authority immediately after birth.
I think that always a simple solution must be somewhere hiding, let's say, but not only simple but costly efficient. I think that I presented you an example of a system that is working with very little money and very little effort, but the system must be in compliance with the habits of the community, and the community to perceive the system that it's its own. Thank you very much.
I'm going to paraphrase two things my colleague said. Once, to paraphrase the name of your ministry, I think registration is the endorsement of a normative act against the diversity of a population. And finally, to also paraphrase what Ivan said, is that right to a name is more than an academic exercise.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and a special thank to our panelists for their contributions. And I believe there is coffee break for all of us. So thanks.